This is a review of the 1969 Jacques Duray film La Piscine, or The Swimming Pool in English, which stars Alain Delon, Romy Schneider, Jane Birkin, and Maurice Ronet. That is an impressive cast. It's a cool-looking movie, but is it a good movie? Well, we'll get to that. If you know me in real life, something you may or may not realize, maybe this is a good tip, I don't know. Maybe it says more about me than anything else, but one thing you might know, or maybe not, is that if you want me to watch a movie that you're interested in, probably the best way to get it to the top of the list is to complain about it, especially if it's a classic movie or some sort of art film, something that might have some sort of depth. If you come and rave about it, the movie will get on the list, but I got a long list. If you want to take a shortcut to the top and really pique my interest, the best thing to do is to be skeptical about the intellectual value of a movie. I can't resist digging into a movie that someone I know is skeptical about most of the time. This movie came to me from a friend who saw it in a theater, actually, some sort of art house theater, and was not super thrilled about the movie. I think mainly just sort of bored. Perhaps he confided in me, and I thought, well, let me make a public account of this. And I checked the movie out, and to be honest, my friend is, for the most part, I think, completely in line, completely right. This movie is slowly paced. Its motives, its points, its purpose are somewhat undercover, take work to uncover if there are any. And overall, I wouldn't really recommend this movie. But here's the video. Here's some thoughts. Here's some things to think about, potentially. So first, the basics of the plot. Alain Delon and Romy Schneider, Jean-Paul and Marianne in the film, are a couple who are perhaps not happy, but they have a somewhat glamorous life together. They're vacationing currently near Saint-Tropez, which is in France, but fairly close to Italy, I think. And they've got this beautiful house. One of the big features of this central thing is the pool, which is a major player in the film. And they just sort of start out going back and forth in their relationship, where it's just sort of hot and cold, maybe in some ways. In some ways, it's a little bit hard, perhaps, to understand exactly what their relationship is supposed to be portrayed as. This is something that I think has gotten a bit lost as time has gone by. In the film, there's a lot of context of the time about what a relationship would look like versus now that makes it a little bit hard to interpret exactly whether or not they're supposed to be, how happy they're supposed to be. Clearly, it's not supposed to be a good, a completely solid relationship, but it's a little bit unclear what exactly was intended. But the point is that they are visited by Harry, who is an old friend of Jean-Paul and Marianne, who's actually known both of the two of them for longer than they've known each other, and who in the past has perhaps had some sort of relationship with Marianne. Harry shows up with his daughter. Nobody knew that Harry had a daughter, but here she is, a beautiful young woman. This is Jane Birkin, who informs Alain Delon, Jean-Paul, that she's 18, and there's sort of a funny gag when she says she's 18 in the film, sort of a interesting mechanic. But this arrival seeds a lot of ambiguities, questions about which relationships will sustain, and such. There's ambiguities, for one, because it's not exactly clear, this Penelope character, Pen, in the film, it's not exactly clear what her relationship with Harry is. It's not even clear that she actually is his daughter, necessarily. It's not clear if Alain Delon might be interested in Penelope. It's not clear if Harry and Marianne might resume their previous acquaintance. It's not clear if they had a previous acquaintance. This ambiguity sort of undoes the tenuous balance that the film opens with. And this sort of this seeds one of the main sort of elements of the plot, which is basically a bit of a tension, sexual tension, and an overarching question of who is going to sleep with who and who is going to drown in the pool. You basically know that this is kind of going to be the way that things go from early on in the movie. Who's going to sleep with who, and who will drown in the pool? Now, the question is this movie more than that? Or is it just sort of a slow-paced, moody thriller about the restless rich? Or is it more? Well, I don't know, to be honest. Is there some level of self-awareness? Is there some depth? I think there is a little bit. First of all, let me say that the acting in this movie is good. Alain Delon is really a good actor, and I would strongly suggest a lot of his other movies, The Leopard, Plain Soleil, Rocco and His Brothers, La Samurai. Lots of interesting movies. And Alain Delon, I think, maybe has a reputation of being a bit of a heartthrob, but really is a pretty good actor as well. Same with Romy Schneider. And they, to be honest, do a good job in this movie. Particularly, there's a lot of attention to detail in terms of sort of micro gestures. This is a very slowly paced and understated movie. There are a lot of interactions which are delicate. Just somebody looking at someone else in a certain way. This movie sort of captures that nicely, and I like that. Here's a question: is the pool? This movie is called The Pool, and the pool is a big part of it. And what exactly are we to make of this? Well, there's a lot of different cinematic antecedents for pools out there. You got the pool in the Henri-Georges Clouzot film Diabolique. In that movie, the pool kind of represents, or there's some sort of haunting guilt in the pool from the murder that's going on. There's the film Sunset Boulevard, where there's a pool, which is sort of a luxury, but also a perilous luxury, I guess, of the upper class. In The Graduate, the pool allows Benjamin to drift, to be alienated, to be disconnected in some ways. In Three Colors Blue, the pool is a completely different sort of refuge and intensity, a way of getting back in touch with nature and, well, maybe not nature, but a way of self-isolating in some sort of intensely introspective way. We've got The Swimmer as well. I've mentioned this movie on the channel a number of times. I think I talk about it in more depth in my Love Actually video. The Swimmer is more of a incisive, biting, subversive look at suburbia through the lens of the swimming pool. Okay. You also have historical things going on with the pool. So public pools in France, for instance, were, I think, a large part of France's step towards national hygiene after the Second World War. So France, in repositioning itself as an exporter of culture, mainly, and less so a manufacturer of cars and such, had a number of programs of sort of hygiene, national hygienic programs, mainly targeted at young women. Interesting history, best got from a book, not from what I can just sort of half remember from a class I took a while ago. But pools, public pools in particular, are a big part of this. And public pools have been a focal point of hygienic dynamics in a lot of countries. In China, public pools there. In the United States, public pools and their relationship with segregation. Okay, interesting stuff. Now, does any of that make sense in this movie? Well, I think that actually all of it kind of does. So you talk about the haunting guilt of the pool from Diabolique. Well, that's here in this movie to some extent, both a haunting guilt of a crime that's going to be committed that will involve a pool, but also perhaps some sort of class guilt to some degree is embodied in the pool. We mentioned the disconnection factor of The Graduate. Well, disconnection and alienation are a big part of this movie, it seems like, and the pool perhaps embodies that to some extent. Like I said, The Swimmer is this sort of incisive look at sort of the upper class, and this movie, to some degree, has that. And so you could maybe try and put this all together and say that in this film there's some sort of, despite seeming like a luxury, there's some sort of lurking guilt in the pool. There's some sort of sinister thing below the surface, which will manifest itself with a death. But in general, the sort of separate, isolated, hygienic, private nature of the pool has its own class-based sinister things, I guess. But it's a little bit hard to know if the movie's really wants you to take these sort of subversive cues from it, or if it's more or less just wanting to play it straight. I don't know. Here's some other details from the movie that were kind of interesting. These are mostly scenes that I just like, little moments that I like. There's a card game that goes on at one point, I think Gin, that's being played between two characters, I forget which, and they're sitting, drawing cards, and then suddenly one of them draws a card and puts down all their cards, the game's over, and they say, oh, that was the card I was waiting for. This is nice foreshadowing, hypothetically, for tension in the film, right? So this is a slowly paced film where things slowly build up, accumulating cards, and then bang, something, hypothetically, will happen. There's another great scene where there's a swimming race between Harry and Jean-Paul in the pool. Their relationship is interesting. The telephone in this movie has a very interesting role. So there's a big part of this movie is sort of isolation to some extent. I'll touch on that a little bit more, but the telephone ends up being a crux of the plot in a number of different places. So Harry's arrival is precipitated by a telephone. Some events later on the film that I won't spoil are precipitated by a telephone. So in the telephone, you've got modernity, you've got some sort of economic network that they're connected into, and having that sort of power along the plot and having that be contrasted perhaps to the luxury vacationing is kind of interesting. Finally, there's a nice scene of a tray being carried around full of drinks, a very shaky sort of tray being balanced, which again sort of hints at this tension. Now, these, again, hint at kind of a forthcoming plot event, but they also perhaps hint at some sort of tension beneath the surface more generally. Another thing that's sort of interesting in this movie is the presence of the help. Despite sort of frolicking on their own, seeming totally private or whatever, there is some sort of servant, some sort of maid who also takes care of the house and cooks food and tends to the premises and such, which is a pretty interesting thing to have slid in there, and it's sort of interesting contrast. This character is not played as some sort of didactic character, but is also not played as some sort of glamorous thing. So like I said, there are coming issues here that are being foreshadowed perhaps, but maybe there's also some more general dilapidation that's being touched on here. Like I said, the maid is not a glamorous character, and in general, this movie's relationship with glamour is very interesting. So the film starts out with a scene of Alain Delon and Romy Schneider frolicking around the pool. These are famously, beautiful, glamorous people, and the movie to some extent really leans into that. It's a very lushly photographed film, a film that's sort of filmed almost voyeuristically in a way, in the way it's framed, and that kind of leans into these people and their bodies, especially in the beginning, and does seem to glamorize them. The fashion in this film, for instance, was definitely carefully curated. Now, on the other hand, this isn't a glamorous sort of situation. Like I said, there's this tensions, there's these things under the surface, and the literal events of the film are far from glamorous as well. I think one of the biggest parts where glamour starts to fall apart, though, is when we hear about some failures and some fears. So the failures come into play when you start to learn a little bit more about some of the people and their relationships, and things are a little bit more complicated. For instance, you wonder, what does Jean-Paul actually do? What is his job? And you start to, they sort of hint that maybe he's some sort of writer, but he had some sort of failure in his writing career, and it's not clear what he does now. You also look at the relationship between him and Marianne. It seems like they're two sort of, old lovers who've known each other forever, but you learn later on they've known each other only for like 2 years, and they met at one of Harry's parties, and that casts things in a totally different light. And so there's some degree into which their sort of pedigree is eroded as the film goes on. Harry as well, not exactly clear what he does. With fears, one of the big places here is that you start to realize that they're conspicuously isolated, conspicuously recluse. So it seems at first like they're these cosmopolitan people who would be down with the parties and would be going into town all the time, but they aren't really. And Harry's arrival is met almost with some sort of definitely with some sort of hesitancy, but with some sort of recoil. And later on, Harry goes out to Saint-Tropez, and he brings back with him a bunch of friends who want to have a party at the house. And Alain Delon definitely recoils from this, doesn't want to be a part of this. Like I said, conspicuously recluse. And this idea at the beginning of glamour is slowly kind of eaten away. So this movie is kind of interesting in that it's simultaneously one of the more glamorous films you've ever seen, but it also is more or less about dark undercurrents. Now, you might say that these sort of brooding, moody undercurrents could be part of some sort of glamorous trope or whatever, the troubled millionaire or something like that. Who knows? Like I said, it is a little bit hard to know if this movie has a subversive bone in it, if you should just take it completely at face value, and it is just some sort of thriller with beautiful people in it and such without a whole lot of depth. It wouldn't be a total failure as that kind of movie. It's slowly paced, but the balance between sort of an opening sort of glamorous thing and then some moodiness and then, some well-formed relationships, some well-filmed moments and some delicate characters who, like I said, communicate subtly. And then the movie does sort of transition into more of some sort of drama, mystery, crime sort of film later on. And the balance that it establishes there is not bad if you're willing to sit through a very slowly paced movie. I got to go a little bit back to this thing about the recoiling, about being recluse, though. And I think one thing that's interesting about it, in particular, this party that comes to the house has themes. It's kind of a swinging 1960s party. And this movie came out in 1969. And so it could be that the party is very much just of the time, but it's interesting in some ways because this movie is sort of out of place and out of time otherwise. Like I said, the phone is kind of contrasted to the vacation. It doesn't really seem like they're not visiting cities. This is not a modern film, let me put it that way. There's very little modernism or modernity in this movie whatsoever. This is in some ways a modern film due to the timeline or whatever and the techniques. But there's no conspicuous modernity in this movie. It's sort of a traditional thing, and then except then the phone rings and there's the technology or whatever. And when the party shows up, it's a 60s party, which is sort of jarring in some ways. And how do you reconcile this sort of traditionalism of the pool with the swinging 60s? And to take it a step further, how can we reconcile this with maybe the new wave, right? So there's an interesting dynamic here to some extent. Some people, in film history, some movements arise as being important in film history for various reasons, and a lot of them are, but very rarely does sort of the history of the major movements in film actually tell you a story about what movies would have come out in any given year, right? And often the big revolutionary movements were not what the bulk of the movies were. They certainly weren't what all of the movies were. And so you talk about French film in the 60s, and people think about the new wave, obviously. But there are tons of movies. First of all, there's a ton of different things within the new wave, certainly. All kinds of different directors who are sort of there or adjacent to it. But there were also all kinds of movies that are being made at the same time that don't really fall into that category, or that kind of do, or that are sort of influenced by it, and otherwise not. So this movie isn't really a new wave film. I don't know. It has sort of that traditional thing going on. It has sort of a criminal heritage. It's sort of a bit of a thriller thing going on. It's not some sort of nimble street film. It is a sort of lush film that's captured on, that's sort of attached to a certain traditional glamour. Okay, is it maybe playing a similar game to something like Contempt? Maybe. I'm not sure. But here's the point. The party, perhaps, is maybe something that's representing this newer movement, right? The 60s in general and the new wave in particular, maybe, are being contrasted. And maybe we have some sort of cultural moment happening here where the film is actually, to some extent, self-aware of these currents pulling away from each other. And Jean-Paul's reluctance to be a part, to think in the terms of the new movement or something like that. His isolated glamour or something along those lines, predicated on a pool, predicated on something that is sort of inherently dark in some ways, a private pool that may or may not be the site of a murder. So there's something to that, I think. Like I said, maybe some people would just say that, in fact, the whole movie, that in fact this is more of a new wave film. I don't really think so, and that it's doing something along the same lines as Contempt. But I don't think so. I think instead, if you had to pull out a thesis for this film as an intellectual film, you would say perhaps cultural critique, reconciling traditional film, crime film, and sort of glamorous movies, sort of commercial things, and the glamorous images of French aristocrats, actors, and actresses with a sort of newer movement. And mainly, the traditional people come off the worst here, mainly seeming sort of insipid or whatever, I guess. Like I said, though, it's hard to know if you should take this movie straight. This is a film, I think, about ennui and dissatisfaction that for the most part ends up being listless and unsatisfying. And like I said, overall, I'm not sure I would recommend this, but I'm trying to get the gears turning a little bit here. I by no means have this all figured out, but I'm trying to get the gears turning a little bit for some of the ideas and themes that I think are more or less there, some of the undercurrents in the film. And I think this is definitely a subtle movie. It's definitely slowly paced, but it does have some interesting components to it. And so that's the Pool, Jacques Deray. I will also mention briefly this movie was remade by the director of Call Me By Your Name recently as something called, I think, A Bigger Splash. I was considering watching that and reviewing them both, but I didn't particularly enjoy this movie, and I don't think the new one is any good either, so I couldn't bring myself to it. But his remake of Suspiria is a sort of interesting movie that was widely panned, but I think is actually pretty good. So maybe I will check out A Bigger Splash at some point. But for now, that's La Piscine.